There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
I am here with David from the American Midwest and from one of my very most favorite booktube channels, Shelf Possessed. David, welcome.
Hello, everybody.
How fantastic to finally meet you. I have just had a fabulous chat with David and his partner in crime, Craig, and that will have gone up on a vlog long before you see this. We're here to talk about a Japanese novel that I'm very interested in and which David apparently loves passionately. It is called Heaven, and it is by Mieko Kawakami, translated by the duo Sam Bett and David Boyd. It was published in English last May, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there it is.
There is the cover. There is the book. It's beautiful.
Very beautiful cover.
Yes.
Yep.
And I believe you just recently reread it.
This was my third time reading it. I always find if I find a book that I love, I will become obsessed with it so much. I've read it it was one of the first books that I did for our channel. And I remember reading it, and it was just there are just certain books that kind of come in your life at kind of like the right time, make you kind of think about your childhood and kind of like what you went through in your childhood. And Kawakami's book it just blew me away in the best way.
Wow. So what's the opening premise?
Well, we follow a main character. His name is Eyes. They call him Eyes in the book. And he doesn't have an exact name in the novel. That's just what they call him. So an unnamed narrator. He is given this nickname by the bullies in his class. He finds kind of this kind of budding relationship with this other outcast, this other female named Kojima. And they kind of build this bond together as outcasts while they're trying to kind of survive this school bullying experience.
And that is pretty much all that's on the back cover or on the Goodreads synopsis. So we're not going to go into any more plot details. My understanding is that there is layers of the novel that are philosophical or even religious. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Gosh, I think that's what I love so much about this book. It says so much because usually there's a lot of books about bullying, and usually there's a kind of happy ending. Like usually the bullies get their comeuppance, but Kawakami does not shy away from the brutality of childhood bullying, and she doesn't just hit on it. She makes you stay in it and breathe with the victims of this. So I would say if anybody is kind of triggered by that, not to pick it up, because I think she doesn't shy away from really going there with the brutality of her main characters. But there's this sense of, do you fight back? If you're a victim of this, do you fight back, or do you just take it because that's your lot in life? There's this idea of, well, we have the survival of the fittest. So the strongest are going to survive. They don't want to do it. They're just strong. So she talks a lot about how these bullies kind of see the world. We're strong. So of course we're going to take down the person that can't fight back. I find a lot of the stuff that she writes about in this book fascinating when it comes to kind of philosophical ideas like that. Do you fight back? Do you not fight back? What do you do?
And is this philosophizing and debate, is it something that is filtered through what the characters are thinking, or does it feel in some way separate from those narratives?
It's just really interesting because you have her two main characters. You have Kojima, and then you have Eyes, and Eyes wants to fight back, wants to kind of move on from this because he doesn't understand why he's being bullied so much. And with Kojima's frame of mind, it's, well, this is who we are. The things that make us outcasts are almost like our superpowers in a way. She wants him to embrace his lazy eye, because he does have a lazy eye. That's what he's made fun of for. And she's like, don't think about that as a negative. That's almost your superpower. So embrace that and love that, because that's you. So I think it's those beautiful moments in the novel that kind of shine and kind of make me kind of look back If you've ever been bullied in your life, you kind of look at those kinds of moments where was I being bullied for this specific thing, or was it because these people saw this as a strength of mine? Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm speaking too as somebody who was quite horribly bullied all through school. So yeah, I'm looking forward to reading it for that. I don't think I'll find it triggering, but I think I'll find it, illuminating. Yeah.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's grotesque. It's just all of those things that I love in the book.
There might be a certain kind of reader that we're not going to give away the ending, but there might be a certain kind of reader that might decide whether to read it or not based on how it ends. Could you kind of characterize the ending without giving anything away?
Oh gosh. Yesterday morning, I was kind of going through like some of the important parts, and a lot of the parts were very spoilery. But the ending, since we kind of started with our main character, Eyes, we kind of end with him. But I think that Kawakami kept me wondering about Kojima and what happens to her at the very end, because it's almost she kind of has to have a severe panic attack because they were both bullied at once in this specific setting. And they are told to do something very graphic for their bullies. And she kind of bursts outside of herself, and she flips out on all of them, but she kind of makes them uncomfortable. I don't know how to rephrase it without spoiling.
No, I think that's sufficient. Yeah.
But she's taken away, and we never hear from her again. And there's moments. I don't know how connected you get with books, but I get really invested with the characters, and I start thinking about where are they now, or what happened to them. And I think with this character of Kojima, she still lives in my mind daily, thinking about what happened to her. What is she going through?
This sounds incredibly powerful.
It is.
Have you read Breasts and Eggs? I read Breasts and Eggs.
I have not. I'm very worried, because when I find a book by an author that I love so much and I start to go back through their kind of back catalog, I'm worried that I'm not going to like their other book.
Well, I don't think you would dislike it. I loved half of it and thought the other half maybe they didn't all connect together, but still really glad I read it. I did a review of it, which I'll link in the show notes, but I think it's worth your time. But
you would recommend it?
I do, with kind of qualifications that you may think it doesn't quite all hang together, but you might be like me and be still really glad you read it. And I thought the first half was quite stunning. So
she's a beautiful writer, and I'm really addicted to beautiful prose. And it's just it could be the translation as well. I wish I knew I could read it in Japanese, but it's such a beautiful piece of work.
Thank you very much, David.
You're welcome.
Vansa from India is back. Welcome back, Vansa.
Thanks a lot for having me back again, Sean. It was a lot of fun last time, and I was really thrilled when I saw your message again.
Yeah, well, this book sounds really interesting, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you about it. It is by an author that I read for the very first time earlier this year, the Italian-French writer Giono, who wrote in French, lived in France and wrote in French. And this novel that was originally published apparently in 1968, Ennemonde, and it was translated into English by Bill Johnston and published last autumn by Archipelago Books, and you quite liked it.
I really liked the book because
you loved it. Actually, I'm sorry, you gave it 5 stars. You loved it.
So my dad and I are huge fans of Peter Mail's books, and especially because he writes about Provence so lovingly, and he makes it sound so fun, and with it's so beautiful, and you have this general view of Provence as this very lovely place and golden sunlight and inspiring so many famous artists and all that. So I picked up this book because I saw that it was written by a Provençal writer and set in Provence. So I thought that would be an interesting read from the perspective of a person native to that, and get his view on it. And this was completely different to anything I had ever read about Provence. Giono's view of the place is, so since he writes from the perspective of a native son of the soil, so to speak, he talks about the people who are actually living off the land, the ones who actually work on those beautiful wheat fields and those lovely sunflower fields. And living off the land is difficult. It's a hard life. You're subject to the vagaries of nature. You're mostly living in places which are isolated and cut off from your marketplaces. You have to figure out how to transport all of that. And a lot of times and if your harvest fails, then your belts have to be tightened. Your family is going to have to eat less food. So Giono's view is that living a life like this, which is so precarious, it's going to harden your soul. And you're then going to view all your interactions, all your activities as, how is this going to benefit me? And you're going to only end up doing something that completely benefits you, even at the cost of harming a family member or somebody close to you or somebody who doesn't deserve it at all. It gave me a lot more to think about the place, actually, from the superficial view I had of it as a tourist, because we even went on holiday there because my dad and I love Peter Mill's books so much.
Like any place else in the world, it has its dark side, and that's what Giono gives us.
Exactly. There's 3 parts to it. The first part, actually around 60%, 70% of the book, is the title story itself, about the eponymous Ennemonde, who is a heroine, who is a very ambitious woman who finds herself in a situation that she then has to work her way out of. It's how she does that, and it's how she finds her way out of it at the cost of quite a few relationships. And the other 2 parts, though, one bit is, it's a description of the ecosystem of the land. So, for instance, he starts with the rivers and he talks about how one part of nature flows into another part. And it's very beautifully written and it's very evocative. But underlying it, there is that undercurrent of danger. And it's very much, he's not blinded by, descriptions of sunlight and all that. Giono very much knows that nature is red in tooth and claw. He just explores life amongst 4 generations of men who live in the Camargue, the marshy wetlands part of France. And he sort of explores how that region has become less and less populated as people move away from there and don't really want to live off the land anymore, and how much harder life gets, the isolation, and again, very well described. So yeah, to answer your question, character driven, the nature and the landscape, that actually drives the plot itself.
Interesting. Now, Ennemonde is the protagonist, or the main character, human character.
Characters.
And did I understand from what you just said that is a woman?
It's a woman, yes.
It's a woman. And in the other 2 sections that you talked about, does she show up in those sections?
She doesn't.
Oh, interesting. So the human character we meet first, and then he goes off in all directions or in different directions for the final 2 sections. And did you feel it all kind of made a satisfying whole? You must have.
I did, actually. I very much did, because the Ennemonde story has a perfectly satisfying conclusion. The other 2 actually really just added to my enjoyment of the first bit, because you get those descriptions of the landscape and the countryside in Ennemonde itself, and he expands on that in the next 2 sections, and they form only around 20% of the book. But his writing is really good. He writes very evocatively, and I'm not even a person who enjoys nature writing too much, but I hugely enjoyed this. In the Ennemonde section, you meet a lot of very interesting characters. There's her husband, there's a circus strongman, there's all her children who are also actually very interesting characters and very memorable. And so you meet a lot of characters, but it's not, so for instance, Peter Mill writes about a lot of local people that he meets, and they're all very quirky and fun. But I mean, and I love Peter Mill, it's not to criticize that, it's just that nobody is quirky and fun in this. All their quirks bring an aspect of danger to it, and all of them are trying very hard to survive.
Was this your first by Giono?
It was. I'd actually never even heard about him, and it's very surprising because I mean, when we went on holiday to Provence, I was looking up things to read, and his was not amongst the top few names, which is so surprising because he is from Provence. But I guess that's more because so many of his works are not available in translation. I'd actually seen that in your Goodreads as well. You had read To the Slaughterhouse yourself. So yeah, so I added that to my TBR as well because his interesting style of writing.
Well, you go ahead and read To the Slaughterhouse, and I'm definitely going to check out Ennemonde, and I'm really glad that you came on and told us all about it. Vansa,
Yeah, it
thank
was.
you so much.
I hope more people read it. It's a really rewarding book.
Lara from Newfoundland is back. Welcome back, Lara.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
We're going to talk about a Newfoundlander author, Wayne Johnston, and his newest novel, which just came out last September, The Mystery of Right and Wrong. And I think it's the first time you and I have talked about a Newfoundland writer.
It is.
You should have some extra expertise in this department.
I do.
Tell us about The Mystery of Right and Wrong.
Well, let me tell you first a little bit about Wayne Johnston for people who aren't really familiar. I first met him as an undergraduate student taking a course in Newfoundland literature in the 90s. And one of the books that we read was The Story of Bobby O'Malley by Wayne Johnston, which was hilarious and also quite poignant. And he came in and spoke to our class. And ever since then, I've pretty much read all his books, almost all 5-star reads for me. He's best known for his colony of unrequited dreams around the sort of biography and mythology of Joseph R. Smallwood, who was our first premier and the politician who brought Newfoundland into confederation with Canada in 1949 on April Fool's Day. So he's best known for that book and for the other books that are connected to it. This latest one is quite a departure from his previous writing. The Mystery of Right and Wrong.
Yeah.
It's a heavy novel. I first learned about it. I was driving between meetings and had on CBC radio and caught part of an interview with somebody. I just knew it was a man's voice being interviewed. And this guy was talking about how one day his brother-in-law, who he'd never met, showed up at his house and told him that his wife was in a mental hospital and that she'd told people that she'd been sexually abused by her father for years and that her sisters would have gone through the same thing. So this was Wayne Johnston's real life experience. This is how he found out what was happening with what had happened to his wife, Rose, and to her sisters. And so
it's his wife's sister's husband.
Yeah, who we'd never met. It was a fairly new husband by the sounds of it.
Wow.
And they all had sort of slightly chaotic lives in different ways. Although Rose, up to that point, to Wayne, I think, seemed like somebody who something bad had never happened to. So she was sort of packaging things up and living like that. Obviously, the sister who ended up in the mental institution had not coped in the same way. And she was there after a suicide attempt. So this was how I first heard. I just heard this guy on the radio, and I never got the rest of the interview because I had to go to my next meeting or something. Later on, I realized that the person who I'd been listening to on the radio was Wayne Johnston, and he was talking about his wife's real life story, his experience, living through a marriage with that to deal with. But also in the interview, he talked about his own sort of personal demon. He lives with OCD and was quite severe when he was a young man. And for him, it expresses itself as hyperlexia, which is compulsive reading, and hypergraphia, which is compulsive writing, which might seem sort of handy or even romantic for a writer, but I think his experience of it was quite horrific.
Wow.
And he would have, sort of manic episodes where he would write and write and write and write, and it really affected his life quite badly. And he ended up in therapy and medication and since then manages it better. But it's something that, it's an ongoing, it's a chronic thing. So The Mystery of Right and Wrong is quite autobiographical, and it struggles with Rose's history and with Wade's own history and brings them together in one character named Rachel, who is one of 3 main characters in the book and who was based on Rose, but she has Wayne's affliction of manic writing. And that's only half of it. I mean, that's only a portion of it. The father-in-law, Rose's real-life father, boy, he must have been a character. And I don't say that in the jolly character kind of way, obviously. He told his family, his children, that he was a war hero, that he had fought with the resistance when he was a boy in Amsterdam. He was Dutch born and lived through World War II in Amsterdam. And he told his girls and his wife alternate stories. And there was one stream in which he was a resistance fighting hero, protecting Jews and, you know, that whole thing. And in version 2, he ratted out Anne Frank, that he sold her to the Nazis, basically. And so his family lived with that as part of the mythology of their father, who was not only sexually abusive, but physically abusive. And so Wayne Johnston has sort of woven that into this story, this book as well. And so you see, it's a lot. There's a lot going on in this book. There's many, many layers. He's been writing it for decades, you know, put it away, took it out again. And as more things came out about his father-in-law going back and having to add things, and I'm sure there were probably oodles of things he had to leave out. So it's pretty dark.
And it's a novel. It's not a memoir, obviously, if he's putting his experiences and his wife's into a character. Did it read like I'm assuming I know the answer to this question since you gave it 5 stars, that it read like a satisfying literary novel?
It read like a masterpiece.
Okay.
Wow. It's hard to describe. So there are 3 point of views. There are all these storylines. You know, the one of Rachel, who, you know, has this bad history, as do her sisters, from having lived in this household with a father and a mother who sort of turned a blind eye. Yeah. And Rachel's story is told partly in prose from her point of view, but when she has mental episodes, she starts to write in poetry, or more like in verse. So as she becomes manic, she writes differently. So you can tell what sort of state of mind she's in based on how she writes. There's this other point of view, which is her father's. He's one of the other main characters, and he writes in ballad form, in iambic pentameter. He writes, it's called The Ballad of the Clan Van Hout. And that's the sort of the way that he indoctrinates his family with his own personal mythology. Nice. He writes to justify his actions, to tell his personal history, to sort of, I guess, hypnotize his family. And it comes across as so narcissistic. You know, he thinks he's this evil genius, but he also thinks he's sort of a god in the family. Mm-mm. I think because it was so difficult to write about, Wayne Johnston took this tack of giving this guy another way to tell his story.
And that worked for you?
That worked for me, because you could imagine that this deeply disturbed, murderous in the book person, and I won't go into details, but there's other stuff that happens, psychotic, like a truly horrible person. You can imagine that he would mythologize himself in that sort of very narcissistic vein, where he creates this whole sing-songy, creepy verse, this whole ballad of himself. I bought that hook, line, and sinker. And the third point of view that you get in the story is from a young man named Wade Jackson, which sounds a lot like Wayne Johnston. Mm-hmm. And it's because a lot of it is very obviously thinly veiled, sort of autobiographical stuff. And he doesn't even try to hide it. Like, his father-in-law's real name rhymes with the name of the man in the book. All the daughters, Rose is Rachel, another sister whose name begins with a G in the book. Like, everybody has obviously real life components. For every fictional character, there seems to be a real life character. But he does, I guess, sort of compress things in some ways. So he gets it all in there somehow. I don't know how you keep that many balls in the air with this story with so many layers. Just is like an onion. It just keeps coming out. It's not just the layers of skin, it's the veins in the skin.
I wonder if his wife has spoken publicly, like in interviews since the book came out, or do you know anything about that?
Not that I know of. And that's something he talks about in the afterword, and that I've heard him talk about in an interview. He did sort of have her blessing to release the book. And they also spoke to her, or contacted each of her sisters to make sure that it was okay, that they sent this story out there.
Now, I love reading heavy books that have all kinds of these types of themes in them. Is there anything like, is it unrelentingly intense emotionally? Is there anything that lightens it in moments, or?
It doesn't go into detail of sexual abuse. So if somebody is worried about those kinds of details, I don't recall those being in there. You just know that it's happened, or that it is happening.
Right.
But there's no sort of graphic detail. So it doesn't have that kind of heaviness. It's more of a psychological heaviness.
Okay, well, it sounds amazing. 560 pages.
Yeah, and I think it's a book, I think there'll be some people who will, question whether he has the right to tell the story.
Mm-hmm.
But there'll be, I think, a lot of people who have had lived experience of sexual abuse, particularly from either a father or a father figure, who will feel like there's an ally in this book. I've read some reviews like that, and I feel like that's going to be a whole thing. And I think that's one of the things that he's trying to do, is share a secret and a trauma in a way that's beautiful and showcases people's resilience. It's heavy, but it also, I think it celebrates the people who sort of made it through, and mourns the people who didn't.
Lara, thank you so much.
Thanks, Sean.
It gives me great pleasure to welcome for her first appearance on Bite Size Book Chats, Diane from Madison, Wisconsin. We are old Litsy friends, but we're meeting for the first time. So this is very exciting. Diane, welcome.
Thank you. It's really great to be here, Sean.
I have been following Diane on Litsy and on Goodreads for years. And I just noticed that she had read a novel from the Portuguese colony off the coast of Africa. Diane can tell us more about that. Cape Verde. And the novel is called The Last Will and Testament of Senhor de Silva Araújo by Germano Almeida, translated from the Portuguese by Sheila Faria Glaser. So this novel sounds fascinating, Diane. Please tell us what it's about.
Well, it's about Senhor de Silva.
Yeah.
And it really is. It's about Senhor de Silva's life. And the novel starts right when he dies. And it begins with the reading of his will, which is 387 pages long.
A 387-page will.
Indeed.
And how many pages is this novel? Because it's not nearly that length, is it?
The novel's only 150.
Well, I think that's probably a wise choice on the author's part, but yes, Please continue.
So it starts with the reading of his will, and as we go through the novel, we gradually find out more about Senhor de Silva and his life. He basically wants to communicate to everybody with the reading of the will who he is as a person. And we find out later on in the novel, some of that stuff is true and some of it is not true. Was he as good a person as he put out there in the world? Maybe not. But he wasn't all bad either.
This was published in 2004 in translation.
Yep. Published in Portugal in 1991.
tell us a little bit more about the setting. I don't know anything about Cape Verde. In fact, am I pronouncing that place name right? I think so.
Honestly, I don't know, but I think you are.
I don't think it's Cape. I
it.
don't think it's Cape Verde. It's Cape Verde. So,
Yeah.
tell us just a little bit about it.
Cape Verde. Well, so I picked up the book because I'm participating in a challenge this year called Reading Africa.
Oh, yeah.
And so Cape Verde is one of the countries. It's considered an African country.
Okay.
But it's really a Portuguese. It started and still is a Portuguese country. It's settled by the Portuguese.
Right.
Its heyday was in the 15th and 16th, maybe 17th century with the slave trade. It's just off the coast of Senegal, so it's in a very auspicious spot for ships going across the Atlantic. But then until the 20th century, their fortunes sort of were not as good. Economic downturn, I guess you'd call
Economic
it.
downturn, post-slavery days. I'm just
Right,
feeling
right.
very sad about that so far.
Well, at least in this novel, I don't know what the demographics of Cape Verde are. If there's a large African population there, it seems to me most of the people were Portuguese.
And our protagonist is Portuguese.
Yes.
And our author.
So it read more to me like a Portuguese novel than something that might feel more African, I think.
Okay. We talked offline about what would be and wouldn't be a spoiler, and there isn't much to spoil, but the one thing that we thought might be a spoiler, we're not going to talk about, but there are some surprises for the people sitting around listening to the will. And I believe his nephew, who's described in the Goodreads synopsis as a smug nephew, expecting to be the sole inheritor because this guy was single and no kids that anybody particularly knew about, right?
Yep.
And then it gets really complicated from there. What do you want to say about that?
Well, it's one of those things, the nephew is like basically running his business for him, taking care of his life, making sure that he's earning money and stuff. And he doesn't really know about any of the things that might be going on behind the scenes, but it turns out he doesn't know his uncle that well because the will doesn't turn out the way he thinks it will, basically.
And that's not a spoiler to say, but anything more specific about in which way, we're not going to touch that. But how about the tone of this story? Is it funny? Is it comedic or satirical? Or
it's not really comedic, although it has a bit of humor with it because this guy Senhor de Silva has such a sense of self-importance about himself that some of the things that he does and says, you have to roll your eyes. Oh my Lord, why are you doing that? I can't believe you're presenting yourself that way.
There is a quality of self-importance. There's an arrogance to the man.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that the synopsis says is that by the end, he is humanized.
It is. We find out more about Senhor de Silva as we go along. And as we go along, we find out a lot of the early parts of the book are parts of things that we're picking up information from his 387-page will, which is really, it's not about him dispersing his assets as much as it is about him telling the story of his life, right?
That's right.
And so we find out things about him from his point of view, from what he's written down in his will. But towards the end, we've reached the end of the will and we've gotten to the dispersal of assets kind of thing. And then we hear more from other characters and we hear about things from their point of view. And all of a sudden things start looking a little bit different than they had before.
Not so cut and dry. By the way, I should have asked this earlier, but if it's relevant at all, what was the man's job? You said his nephew was kind of running his business for him. What was his business?
Import, export.
Import, export. There you go.
What else do you do on an island, right?
Right.
He died when the character died when he was like 60 or 70. So I want to say it ends somewhere in the 50s, 1950s.
Okay. And the author was born in 1945 in Cape Verde, and he is playing for my team. He's gay. He's got a husband. So that's any gay characters in the novel?
Not overt.
Not overtly. Well,
No.
I'm curious to see if he's written anything that's gayer than this, but this one sounds really interesting. Did it remind you of anything else you've read?
It did, and it's called The Posthumous Memoirs of Brás, Cubas, written by Machado de Assis. Have you heard of it?
I have, and I've heard that novel is really good.
it is really good,
Yeah.
and it's quite funny in a way this one wasn't. But it reminded me sort of this.
Similar
it sort of
structure.
sounded similar.
Similar structure.
That Senhor de Silva was telling his story from beyond the grave, as the character in the posthumous memoirs is telling his story beyond the grave. It's a little bit different in that Brás Cubas is actually dead and writing his story.
Diane, this was great. Thank you so much. I hope you'll come back someday.
I would like to, Sean. Thank you. It's been
Thanks.
great being here.